detection looks good, no corrosion. Moving on. Copy, continuing along line. Everything nominal.
The following account has been reconstructed from multiple sources. Helmet camera footage, recovered from the dive site on September 14, 2023, audio logs recorded by the research vessel Meridian Star, personal journals maintained by expedition members, internal communications from Pelagic Deep Research Institute, and the official incident report filed with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, significant portions of which remain classified under national security protocols. Names of certain individuals have been changed at the request of their families. The footage described in this document has not been released to the public and is currently held in a secure NOAA facility in Silver Spring, Maryland, access to which requires Level 5 clearance and written authorization from the Director of Ocean Exploration. Marcus Chen had been diving for 23 years, and in that time he had seen things that would make most people reconsider their relationship with the ocean. He had explored the rusting hulks of World War II submarines in the Philippine Sea. He had descended into the blue holes of Belize, where the limestone walls narrowed until they seemed to be swallowing him whole. He had been present for the discovery of hydrothermal vents off the coast of Oregon, watching creatures that looked like they belonged to another planet, thriving in water, hot enough to cook flesh. None of it had prepared him for what he found 147 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean on September 12, 2023, in a location approximately 200 miles east of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, in a cave system that, according to every geological survey ever conducted in the region, should not exist. The expedition had begun 3 weeks earlier as a routine deep-water mapping project, funded by a consortium of universities and private research foundations. The Meridian Star, a 180-foot research vessel equipped with state-of-the-art sonar systems and a saturation diving facility capable of supporting operations to 1,000 feet, had been surveying a section of the continental shelf that had shown unusual acoustic signatures during a preliminary scan in 2021. The team consisted of 12 researchers, 4 saturation divers, and a crew of 15, all operating under the direction of Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, a marine geologist from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution who had spent her career studying underwater cave formations. The acoustic anomaly they were investigating appeared on sonar as a void, a pocket of empty space in the seafloor, approximately 400 meters in diameter, located beneath a layer of sediment that geological models suggested had been undisturbed for at least 40,000 years. Dr. Okonkwo had initially theorized that the void was a collapsed lava tube, a remnant of volcanic activity from the Pleistocene epoch. She would later describe this theory, in her personal journal, as the last rational thought she had about the project before. Everything changed. The first dive occurred on September 10, 2023, conducted by Marcus Chen and his dive partner, Elena Vasquez, a former Navy diver with 15 years of experience in deep-water salvage operations. They descended through the water column in a diving bell, breathing a helium-oxygen mixture that would allow them to work at depth without the nitrogen narcosis that makes traditional scuba diving dangerous below 130 feet. The descent took 47 minutes. Marcus would later describe the experience in his audio log as unremarkable until they passed the 600-foot mark, at which point something changed in the quality of the darkness around them. It wasn't that the water became darker, he explained, because at that depth there was no natural light anyway, only the beams of their helmet-mounted lamps cutting through the black. It was more that the darkness itself felt different, denser somehow, as if the water was resisting their presence in a way that went beyond simple physics. Elena reported a similar sensation, describing it in her log as the feeling of being watched by something that doesn't have eyes. Both divers attributed these impressions to the psychological effects of deep diving, the subtle ways that pressure and isolation can play tricks on the human mind. They continued their descent. The seafloor at 847 feet was a plain of grey sediment, featureless, except for the occasional outcropping of rock and the scattered shells of deep-water mollusks. Marcus and Elena spent 30 minutes surveying the area, collecting samples and recording video footage that would later be analyzed by the science team aboard the Meridian Star. They found nothing unusual until Marcus noticed a shadow in his peripheral vision, a darker patch in the already dark water, approximately 50 meters to the east. He adjusted his trajectory and swam toward it, his helmet camera recording everything, and at 2:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, he became the first human being in recorded history to lay eyes on the entrance to what would come to be known, in classified documents, as Site 7734. The entrance was a roughly circular opening in a rock formation that rose from the seafloor like a broken tooth, approximately 15 meters in diameter, angled downward at roughly 30 degrees. The rock surrounding the entrance was unlike anything Marcus had seen in 2 decades of diving. It was too smooth, too regular, with edges that seemed almost carved rather than formed by natural erosion. He reported his findings to the surface. Dr. Okonkwo instructed him to photograph the formation, but not to enter until a proper survey could be conducted. Marcus acknowledged the order. Then, according to his own audio log, something happened that he could not explain. He heard a sound. Sound travels differently underwater than it does in air, and at 847 feet, the ambient noise is usually limited to the hiss of breathing apparatus and the occasional groan of the oceans. Pressure against the diving equipment. What Marcus heard was neither of these things. It was, he would later describe, like a voice speaking a language he didn't recognize, coming from inside the cave, rising and falling in patterns that suggested meaning without conveying any meaning he could understand. Eleanor, swimming approximately 20 meters behind him, did not hear the sound. Her audio equipment recorded nothing unusual. But Marcus's recording, when analyzed later by acoustic specialists at MIT, contained anomalies that defied explanation. There were frequencies present that should not have been possible at that depth, vibrations in ranges that human vocal cords cannot produce, and that no known marine animal has been documented to create. The specialists concluded that the sounds were likely equipment malfunction, artifacts of pressure-induced distortion in the recording apparatus. Marcus knew what he heard. He did not believe it was equipment malfunction. He swam closer to the cave entrance and directed his helmet light into the darkness beyond, and for approximately 3 seconds, the camera captured something that would become the most analyzed piece of footage in the history of marine research. The walls of the cave, visible for perhaps 30 meters before the darkness swallowed the beam, were covered in carvings. The dive was aborted immediately. Marcus and Elena returned to the diving bell and began their ascent, a process that would take nearly 6 hours due to the decompression requirements of saturation diving. During that time, the footage was transmitted to the Meridian Star via fiber optic cable and reviewed by Dr. Okonkwo and her team. The initial reaction, according to multiple witnesses, was disbelief. The carvings visible in the footage were intricate geometric, arranged in patterns that repeated with mathematical precision across every visible surface of the cave wall. They depicted shapes that resembled no known art style from any human culture, angular forms that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of the light, creating an optical illusion of movement even in still frames extracted from the video. Dr. Okonkwo's first instinct was that they were looking at a natural phenomenon, some form of crystalline structure or biological growth that mimicked the appearance of intentional design. This theory lasted approximately 4 hours until the expedition's archaeologist, Dr. James Whitmore from the University of Chicago, completed his preliminary analysis and announced, in a voice that several witnesses described as shaking, that the carvings were unquestionably artificial. They had been made by tools. They had been made by hands. And based on the sediment accumulation patterns visible in the footage, they had been made at least 50,000 years before modern humans were supposed to have existed in North America. The following 24 hours aboard the Meridian Star were characterized by what Dr. Okonkwo would later describe as controlled chaos. Additional footage was requested. Samples were demanded. Arguments erupted over protocol, over safety, over the fundamental question of what they were dealing with. Dr. Whitmore insisted that they were looking at evidence of a previously unknown civilization, a culture capable of underwater construction that predated the last ice age. Dr. Okonkwo countered that such a conclusion was premature, that there could be explanations they hadn't considered, that jumping to extraordinary claims would destroy their credibility if they proved to be wrong. The ship's captain, a veteran mariner named Thomas Reeves, expressed concerns about the depth and difficulty of the dive site, noting that any extended exploration would push the limits of their saturation diving capabilities. Marcus Chen, still recovering from his first dive, said little during these discussions, but his audio log from the night of September 11th reveals a man struggling with something more personal than scientific disagreement. He recorded his thoughts at 3:17 a.m., speaking in a whisper so as not to wake his crewmates, and what he said was this: the sound he heard in the cave had not stopped. He could still hear it, even in his bunk, even with the white noise of the ship's ventilation system, even with the rational knowledge that he was now nearly 1,000 feet above the seafloor. He could hear that voice speaking in a language he didn't understand. And the worst part, the part that was keeping him awake, was that he was starting to recognize patterns in it. He was starting to understand. The second dive was scheduled for September 12, 2023, and this time the team consisted of 3 divers: Marcus Chen, Elena Vasquez, and a new addition, Dr. Peter Holbrook, a marine archaeologist with cave diving certification who had been helicoptered to the Meridian Star overnight from a research station in Bermuda. The plan was to penetrate the cave entrance, proceed no more than 50 meters into the interior, document the carvings in detail, and collect samples of the rock for dating analysis. The dive plan was reviewed and approved by Dr. Okonkwo, Captain Reeves, and the ship's diving supervisor, a former commercial saturation diver named Robert Red Morrison, who had more deep-water experience than anyone else aboard. None of them, reviewing the plan in the ship's operations center, could have known that only 2 of the 3 divers would return to the surface, and that what those 2 brought back with them would change everything they thought they understood about human history and the nature of the ocean itself. The descent on September 12th was faster than the first dive, the team now familiar with the water column and eager to reach the site. Marcus led the way, his helmet camera recording continuously, with Elena and Peter following in a staggered formation designed to maximize their coverage of the cave interior. They reached the entrance at 1:23 p.m. and paused at the threshold, while Peter attached a guideline to a rock formation near the opening, a standard safety precaution that would allow them to find their way back if visibility deteriorated or their lights failed. As Peter worked, Marcus floated near the cave entrance and directed his light inside, and this time, with the improved optics of his newly calibrated camera, the carvings were visible in stunning detail. They covered every surface, the walls, the ceiling, even the floor where sediment had not accumulated, an endless tapestry of geometric patterns interspersed with shapes that might have been figures, or might have been symbols, or might have been something else entirely that human perception could only approximate as figures or symbols, because the mind needed to categorize what it was seeing. The patterns were not random. Even on first inspection, Marcus could see that they followed rules, that certain shapes appeared in predictable sequences, that the spacing between elements was consistent to within millimeters. Whoever had made these carvings had done so with precision that rivaled modern engineering in an environment that should have made such precision impossible, at a time when, according to every archaeological model of human development, the most sophisticated tools available were sharpened stones. The team entered the cave at 1:31 p.m. The passage angled downward at approximately 30 degrees for the first 20 meters, then leveled out into a horizontal tunnel roughly 10 meters in diameter. The carvings continued unbroken, flowing across the rock surface like a story being told in a language that no living person could read. Peter's camera captured close-up footage of individual symbols, while Marcus documented the overall layout, and Elena maintained their position relative to the guideline. Communication with the surface remained clear, the fiber optic tether transmitting video and audio in real time to the Meridian Star, where Dr. Okonkwo and her team watched in silence. At 1:47 p.m., the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and the transmission from Marcus's camera caused 3 people in the operations center to gasp audibly. The chamber was roughly spherical, approximately 40 meters in diameter, and every inch of its surface was carved. But unlike the tunnel, where the patterns had been abstract and geometric, the carvings in the chamber depicted something recognizable. They depicted figures, humanoid figures, figures that were clearly meant to represent people, with heads and limbs and bodies, but with proportions that were subtly wrong, limbs too long, heads too large, and in place of faces, each figure had the same symbol, a spiral that turned inward on itself until it vanished into a point at the center. The figures were not alone. Surrounding them, dwarfing them, filling the upper portions of the chamber with its carved immensity, was something else, something that was not humanoid, something that the diver's lights could only illuminate in sections, forcing the mind to assemble the pieces into a whole that it did not want to comprehend. Dr. Whitmore, watching the feed from the surface, would later describe it as an octopus. If an octopus had been designed by a geometry that did not exist in nature, with appendages that seemed to extend in directions that the eye could not follow. Captain Reeves, standing beside him, said nothing, but his face, visible in photographs taken by the ship's automated documentation system, had gone the color of old bone. Marcus Chen, floating in the center of the chamber, with his light tracing the contours of the carving, spoke 3 words into his communication system, words that were recorded both on his helmet audio and on the Meridian Star's mission log. "It's looking down." He was right. Whatever the carving depicted, whatever the ancient artists had intended to represent, the central mass of it was positioned directly above the chamber's center, and the suggestion of attention in its carved form was unmistakable. It was looking down at the humanoid figures below it. It was looking down at the space where Marcus now floated. It was looking down at him. The next 4 minutes of footage would become the subject of intense analysis by experts in fields ranging from marine biology to cognitive psychology to theoretical physics, and none of them would be able to provide a satisfactory explanation for what occurred. At 1:52 p.m., Peter Holbrook reported that his light was malfunctioning, flickering in a pattern that did not correspond to any known equipment failure. At 1:53 p.m., Elena Vasquez reported that the water temperature had dropped by approximately 6 degrees, a change that should not have been possible at that depth, where thermal variation was measured in fractions of a degree. At 1:54 p.m., Marcus Chen reported hearing the sound again, the voice from his first dive, and this time the audio. Equipment captured something, a low-frequency vibration that caused distortion in the video feed and triggered alarms on several of the Meridian Star's monitoring systems. At 1:55 p.m., Peter Holbrook's camera captured 3 seconds of footage that, according to Dr. Okonkwo's incident report, does not appear to depict the physical interior of the cave as observed by the other 2 divers. The footage shows darkness, absolute and complete, and within that darkness, movement, something vast, shifting in the black, and then a single point of light that might have been a distant star, or might have been an eye, growing larger, growing closer, until the footage cuts to static. At 1:56 p.m., Marcus and Elena reported that Peter was no longer responding to communication. His light, visible moments before, had vanished. His position on the guideline, tracked by a sensor attached to his diving harness, showed him moving deeper into the cave, past the chamber, into a section that had not been mapped at a speed that should have been impossible for a human diver to achieve. Elena followed the guideline. Marcus followed Elena. They swam for what the timestamps indicate was 3 minutes and 47 seconds, but which both divers would later describe as feeling like hours, pushing deeper into a tunnel that narrowed as it descended, the carvings growing denser, the figures on the walls becoming more numerous, the central presence in those carvings becoming larger, more detailed, more insistent in its carved attention. At 2:00 p.m. exactly, they found Peter Holbrook. He was floating motionless in the center of a smaller chamber, his light extinguished, his body positioned in a way that should have been impossible given the neutral buoyancy of his diving equipment. He was vertical, upright, as if standing on an invisible floor, and his helmet was facing the wall of the chamber, where a section of carvings differed from everything they had seen before. The carvings in this section were fresh. The rock dust still hung in the water around them, the edges still sharp and unweathered, and the carvings depicted 3 figures, humanoid, with limbs and bodies and heads, wearing what was unmistakably diving equipment, positioned in what was unmistakably the chamber where Peter now floated, and above them, looking down, was the same presence that had dominated the main chamber, the same geometry of impossible angles and incomprehensible form. Eleanor's voice on the audio, Recording is barely a whisper. She says, "It knew we were coming." Marcus does not respond. His camera shows him reaching for Peter, gripping his colleague's shoulder, turning him around to face them. Peter's eyes, visible through his helmet visor, were open. His mouth was moving. The audio from his communication system, analyzed later with enhancement technology, contains what appears to be speech, but the words, if they are words, are in no known language. The acoustic pattern, according to the MIT specialists who reviewed the recording, is consistent with the sounds Marcus heard on his first dive. Peter Holbrook was speaking the language of the carvings. The extraction of Peter's body was accomplished in 7 minutes, a process that should have taken at least twice that long, but which felt, to both surviving divers, like a desperate race against something they could not see. They dragged Peter through the tunnels, following the guideline, ignoring the carvings that seemed to multiply around them, ignoring the temperature that continued to drop, ignoring the sounds that were now audible to both of them, a chorus of voices speaking in unison from somewhere deeper in the cave system. They reached the entrance at 2:12 p.m. and continued into open water without pausing, swimming for the diving bell with an urgency that their training told them was dangerous, that risked decompression injury, that violated every protocol they had been taught. They did not care. The diving bell was waiting where they had left it, and they loaded Peter's body inside and sealed the hatch and began the ascent. And only then, only when the seafloor was falling away below them, did Marcus Chen allow himself to look at the cave entrance one last time through the bell's observation port. What he saw was not included in the official incident report. It was not mentioned in Dr. Okonkwo's analysis or Captain Reeves's log or any of the documentation that would eventually be compiled and classified by NOAA. It was mentioned only in Marcus's personal audio log, recorded on the night of September 12th, while he sat alone in the ship's dive equipment room, and the recording was found only because Marcus left it in a location where he knew it would be discovered, along with a note that said simply, "Someone needs to know." What Marcus saw, as the diving bell rose toward the surface and the cave entrance shrank to a dark spot in the darker water below, was light. Not his own light. Not the light of the diving bell or the lights of the Meridian Star far above, but light coming from inside the cave, from deep within the tunnel system. A cold blue radiance that pulsed in rhythms that his mind interpreted as breathing, as waiting, as watching. And in that light, just for a moment, he saw something emerge from the cave entrance and look up at the ascending bell. He could not describe its shape, because its shape did not remain constant, shifting and flowing in ways that geometry should not permit. He could not describe its size because there was nothing to compare it to, nothing at that depth but water and rock, and the ancient carvings that he now understood were not art, were not communication, were not any of the things that the scientists aboard the Meridian Star wanted them to be. They were something else. They were a record. They were a warning. They were a message left by people who had encountered this thing 50,000 years ago and had wanted future generations to know. It was here before us, it will be here after us, and if you find this place, if you disturb this place, if you look upon its face, it will know you forever. Marcus watched the thing watching him, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would never dive again, that he would never be able to enter any body of water deeper than a bathtub, that for the rest of his life he would feel those incomprehensible eyes on him whenever he closed his own. The thing retreated into the cave. The light faded. The bell continued to rise. Peter Holbrook was pronounced dead at 4:47 p.m. on September 12, 2023, approximately 6 hours after the diving bell reached the surface. The official cause of death was listed as drowning complicated by equipment failure, a finding that satisfied none of the expedition members and raised immediate questions among the medical personnel who examined the body. Peter had not drowned. His lungs showed no signs of water infiltration. His diving equipment showed no signs of malfunction. His body showed no signs of trauma, except for one detail that the medical examiner noted but could not explain. His hands were covered in abrasions consistent with prolonged contact with rough stone, as if he had been carving something with his bare fingers for hours or days. The skin on his fingertips was worn down to the bone. When Marcus read this detail in the preliminary report, he thought about the fresh carvings in the small chamber, the carvings that depicted the 3 divers, the carving that had been made after they entered the cave. He thought about Peter's mouth moving, speaking in a language that predated human civilization. He thought about what Peter might have been doing in the minutes between when he disappeared and when they found him standing before that wall. He did not share these thoughts with anyone. Some knowledge, he understood now, was not meant to be shared. The Meridian Star remained on station for 2 additional days, while the research team debated how to proceed. Dr. Okonkwo argued for continued exploration with robotic vehicles, unwilling to abandon a discovery that could rewrite human history. Captain Reeves argued for immediate return to port, citing safety concerns and the need for a full investigation into Peter's death. Dr. Whitmore, who had spent 30 years searching for evidence of pre-Ice Age civilizations, sat in the ship's mess hall, staring at printouts of the cave footage and speaking to no one. The debate was ultimately resolved by an event that occurred on the night of September 14th, 2 days after Peter's death, an event that was witnessed by all 26 people aboard the ship and that none of them would ever speak of publicly. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the Meridian Star's sonar system detected movement at the dive site. The acoustic signature was massive, larger than any known marine animal, larger than the ship itself, and it was rising. The movement was slow, almost leisurely, ascending from the depth where the cave was located toward the surface, where the Meridian Star floated at anchor. Captain Reeves ordered the engines started. The chief engineer reported that they were already running, that they had started on their own, that the ship's systems were behaving in ways he had never seen in 30 years at sea. The exterior lights, which had been dark to comply with overnight protocols, activated simultaneously, flooding the surrounding water with harsh white illumination. And in that illumination, rising from below, every person on deck saw something break the surface. The descriptions provided by the witnesses vary in detail, but agree on essence. They describe something that was not one thing, but many things, connected in ways that the eye could not follow. They describe geometry that hurt to look at, angles that did not exist in the physical world, a form that seemed to occupy more space than it actually displaced. They describe a sound, the same. Sound markers had heard in the cave, now overwhelming, now impossible to ignore. A voice speaking in a language that every person aboard understood for one terrible moment before their conscious minds rejected the understanding and left only the memory of having understood. They describe eyes, or what they perceived as eyes, countless and vast, turning toward the ship with an attention that felt like being dissected. The encounter lasted 17 seconds, according to the ship's chronometer. It felt like hours. It felt like years. Then the thing descended slowly back into the depths from which it had come, and the lights failed, and the engines sputtered and died, and the Meridian Star sat in darkness on the Atlantic Ocean while 26 human beings tried to remember how to breathe. The ship limped into Norfolk, Virginia on September 18, 2023, operating on backup power after the main electrical systems refused to function consistently. A NOAA investigation team was waiting at the dock. So were representatives from agencies that the ship's crew did not recognize and that would never be publicly identified. The investigation that followed was conducted under national security classification, and the expedition members were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that carried penalties including imprisonment. The cave footage was confiscated. The audio recordings were confiscated. Peter Holbrook's body was transferred to a facility in Maryland where, according to the only documentation that has been obtained through legal channels, it remains under study. The Meridian Star was decommissioned and sold for scrap. Dr. Okonkwo returned to Woods Hole, where she took a leave of absence from which she never returned, eventually resigning her position and moving to New Mexico, as far from the ocean as she could get. Dr. Whitmore published no further papers and declined all interviews for the remaining 2 years of his life, dying of a heart attack in his Chicago apartment in 2025. Captain Reeves retired and has not been seen in public since. Elena Vasquez, after a year of psychological treatment, emigrated to Switzerland and now works as a ski instructor, a profession that keeps her in the mountains, far from any significant body of water. Marcus Chen is the only expedition member who has spoken about what happened, and he has done so only once, in a recording made on the first anniversary of Peter Holbrook's death, a recording he sent to a maritime history archive with instructions that it be preserved, but not published for 25 years. The archive, honoring his request, has confirmed the existence of the recording but declined to reveal its contents until 2048. What is known about the recording comes from a brief summary provided by the archivist who received it, a summary that describes Marcus speaking for approximately 47 minutes about the cave, the carvings, the thing that lives in the deep, and what he believes it wants. The summary mentions that Marcus describes the carvings as a diary, that he believes the ancient people who made them were not warning future generations away from the cave, but rather documenting their worship of what they found there. He describes finding evidence in the footage that was confiscated, of structures on the chamber floor that resembled altars, and of stains on the rock that his training as a marine scientist told him were organic in origin. He describes his belief that the thing in the cave is not an animal, not a god, not anything that human categories can contain, but rather something that exists in a relationship to time that is fundamentally different from human experience, something that experiences all moments simultaneously, that saw the ancient worshippers and the modern divers and whatever comes after as a single continuous present. He describes his certainty that Peter Holbrook is not dead in any way that matters, that some part of Peter is still in the cave, still carving, still adding to the record that spans tens of thousands of years. And he describes, in what the archivist notes as the most disturbing portion of the recording, his growing suspicion that the thing allowed them to leave, that it wanted them to leave, that the encounter on the surface was not a threat, but a demonstration, a reminder that it could reach them any time it wished. That distance and depth were irrelevant to something that had been waiting in the dark since before the continents had taken their current forms. The final portion of Marcus Chen's recording, according to the archivist's summary, addresses the question that anyone hearing this account would naturally ask: why is the cave still there? Why hasn't the government sealed it, destroyed it, filled it with concrete and pretended it never existed? Marcus says he asked the same question to one of the unnamed agency representatives who debriefed him, a woman who never gave her name, and who spoke with the flat effect of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Her answer, which Marcus quotes verbatim, was this: "We've tried 3 times. The first time, the demolition team disappeared. The second time, the explosives detonated prematurely and killed everyone on the surface vessel. The third time, the charges simply didn't go off, and when we retrieved them, they had been arranged in a pattern on the seafloor, a pattern that matched the carvings in the cave. We don't go back anymore. We don't send anyone. We monitor from a distance and we watch and we hope that whatever lives down there continues to be satisfied with watching back." Marcus Chen is 61 years old as of the date of this document's compilation. He lives in Arizona, in a house with no swimming pool, no bathtub, only a standing shower with a drain that he checks compulsively every morning to ensure nothing is looking back at him through the pipes. He does not watch ocean documentaries. He does not eat seafood. He does not sleep well, and on the nights when sleep eludes him entirely, he sits in his living room with the lights on and listens for the sound that has never quite stopped, the voice that speaks in a language he almost understands, calling to him from 847 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, calling to him from 50,000 years in the past, calling to him from some other place entirely where time does not work the way he was taught and where something vast and patient continues to carve its story into the rock, adding new figures, adding new names, adding whatever comes next to the record it has been keeping since before there were human eyes to witness it, or human minds to be broken by the witnessing. The dive site, designated as Site 7734, remains under continuous satellite surveillance. NOAA has established a permanent exclusion zone in the area, citing environmental protection concerns. Commercial and recreational vessels are prohibited from approaching within 15 nautical miles. Fishing boats that have strayed into the zone report equipment malfunctions, communication failures, and in 17 documented cases since 2023, crew members describing dreams of a vast chamber deep underwater, where something waits in the dark and asks, in a voice that is older than language, to be seen. The carvings in the cave continue to accumulate. Analysis of acoustic data collected from monitoring buoys indicates an average of 7 new carvings per month, a pace that has remained consistent since measurements began. No one knows who is making them. No one wants to find out.